A heightened sense of anticipation filled the studio. Bright white spotlights flooded the stage, and the audience murmured excitedly, waiting for the show to begin. Broadcast time was just seconds away, and every eye was fixed on two men at the center of the set. On the right, seated comfortably, was legendary actor and director Sylvester Stallone. He looked calm, as if well accustomed to the most intense conversations and harsh critiques. On the left, holding a stack of notes and occasionally glancing at his tablet, was Ethan Caldwell, a journalist known for pushing his guests out of their comfort zones. Today's guest was no exception, and Ethan had no intention of missing the chance to pin him to the wall. A signal from the director, the red camera light blinked on, and the live broadcast began. Ethan, smiling, looking directly at the camera, "Good evening, dear viewers. You're watching Conversations on the Edge with Ethan Caldwell. Today we have a very special episode because my guest is a living Hollywood legend, Mr. Sylvester Stallone. His films defined an entire era of cinema, and the characters he portrayed embodied a traditional ideal of masculinity. Let's find out if that ideal remains relevant today. Welcome to the studio, Sly." Stallone nods and smiles. "Hello, Ethan. Thanks for having me." Ethan, so, I'll start with the obvious question. You're best known for playing strong, steadfast, often laconic heroes Rocky Balboa, John Rambo, and many others. In your opinion, has modern culture lost interest in that classic type of masculinity? Stallone, running his hand along the armrest, relaxed. That's a tough question. I believe masculinity isn't so much about aggression or physical power as it is about character. The ability to endure under pressure, protect your loved ones, and not give up when life knocks you down. I'm not sure if there could ever come a time when those qualities stop being needed. Ethan, nodding in agreement. Interesting. However, there is an opinion that people these days are looking for new heroes. Those who openly display emotion, vulnerability, and a willingness to engage in dialogue instead of using their fists. How do you feel about that trend? Stallone smiles reflectively. I've always said there's nothing wrong with emotions or with being able to talk about what you're going through. My Rocky, for instance, was actually a pretty sensitive guy. He felt fear, doubt, love. There was plenty of all that. But at the same time, he had the strength of character not to back down and to fight to the very end. It's important to distinguish. Vulnerability doesn't conflict with strength. They can coexist. New source of tension. Hollywood's responsibility. Ethan, aiming to dive deeper, glanced at his notes and steered the conversation toward how Stallone's films have influenced society. Ethan, your films have been hugely successful. Rocky was inspiring, while Rambo was tougher and packed with violence. Some say Hollywood, and you in particular, bear responsibility for promoting a culture of force as a way to solve problems. What's your take on that? Stallone, a slight furrow in his brow, growing more serious. I've always tried to show more in my characters than just muscles. The motivation that drives them. Rambo wasn't looking for a fight. He was running from his own trauma. The system rejected him, and he reacted in the only way he knew how. As for violence, film often mirrors real events, albeit in an exaggerated form. Does cinema sometimes glorify violence? Maybe. But in my work, I've always wanted to convey that strength is just a tool. What truly motivates the character is their personal story, their suffering, and their desire to find their place in the world. Ethan, leaning forward slightly, but surely you'd agree that for some viewers, your heroes became symbols of raw, often unrestrained masculinity? Don't you think you could have set a different example? Stallone, shrugging. People see what they want to see in every story. I can't take full responsibility for how someone interprets my films. Sure, creators do have a moral responsibility, but we balance actual life truths, dramatic effect, and what the audience wants to see. And if we're talking about Rocky, there was less aggression and more perseverance, dreams, and devotion to loved ones. And aside, audience reaction applause rippled through the studio. Clearly, the audience sympathized with Stallone's words. Even the harshest critics had to admit that Stallone's roles went deeper than mere fists and guns. Ethan noticed the crowd leaning toward the actor's side. He realized he needed to intensify his strategy to keep the interview under his control. Ethan, with a carefully composed calm, another frequent question is whether the old approach to masculinity might be harmful today. We frequently hear about toxic masculinity, about how constant toughness prevents men from expressing emotions and leads to internal conflicts. What's your view on that? Stallone, arms crossed, but not aggressively. I think it's a mistake to confuse strength with brutality. You can be firm and still remain humane. Toxicity arises when a person can't admit mistakes, shows contempt for others, or believes aggression is the only solution. But resilience, the willingness to act, and taking responsibility for yourself and your loved ones, that's not toxic, that's necessary. Ethan, so you think the modern war on traditional forms of masculinity might be somewhat overblown? Stallone, with a slight smile, I think we often get hung up on discarding the old to bring in something new, something progressive. Progress is good, but strength and endurance have never been superfluous. The question is just how you use them wisely. Plot twist? Personal stories and new details. Ethan decided to dig into personal territory. This often provides deeper insight into a person's motivations. He recalled recent rumors of family issues for Stallone and aimed to turn the discussion more emotional. Ethan, changing his tone to a more empathetic one, you mentioned humanity. May I ask about your personal experiences? You've always been in the public eye, and recently there have been rumors of family problems. Could you share how you managed to stay strong in those situations without becoming callous or harsh? Stallone fell silent for a moment, and the room grew still. He seemed uncomfortable discussing personal matters, but he knew that avoiding the question would make him appear weak in the public eye. Stallone, taking a heavy breath, family situations are always complicated. Sometimes you have to be strong not just for yourself but for your loved ones too. There are times you have to admit your mistakes, step back, and apologize. I've had plenty of tough conversations with my children, with my wife. Finding that balance between being the rock and being empathetic is a constant challenge. But I see that without inner strength, you can't overcome those hardships. A warm wave of empathy passed through the audience. Ethan sensed he had touched a delicate chord. It was time to move on, as pressing further on Stallone's personal life would have been inappropriate. Criticism from Ethan. New roles, new narratives. Ethan, let's shift to something more professional. Hollywood nowadays offers more and more stories where a hero doesn't just throw punches but resolves conflict with words or compassion. Do you see yourself taking roles with no hint of action or competition? Stallone, laughing out loud. Oh, I've tried all sorts of roles. Yes, people mostly know me as a fighter, but I'm also a director and a screenwriter. I'm interested in creating characters whose main battles are internal rather than external. I wouldn't mind playing someone who wins not through force but through intellect or love. The question is, would people believe Sylvester Stallone playing, let's say, a philosophy professor? The audience burst into laughter at the stark contrast. Ethan smiled, admitting it would indeed be unusual. Ethan, that would definitely be something to see. And we circle back to your main point. Strength isn't just physical. Maybe it's time for you to tell us about any upcoming projects? Are you working on anything that might surprise your classic fans? Stallone, thoughtfully, there are a few scripts I'm developing. One of them is about a veteran learning to live with his psychological traumas and helping people like himself through support groups. No battles, no explosions. Everything is much more subtle. For me, that's a challenge, but also a chance to show that true strength can mean recognizing your weaknesses and working through them. Online response. The interview goes viral while the conversation played out in front of a live audience. Social media was already exploding with debate. Someone on Twitter wrote, Stallone demolishes the concept of toxic masculinity, while others shared clips of the interview with captions like, strength doesn't have to be aggressive. Telegram channels and YouTube bloggers picked up on it too. Ethan had hoped to portray Stallone as outdated, but instead, many viewers sympathized with the actor for his candid responses. closing part of the discussion wanting to avoid handing Stallone an uncontested victory in the public eye. Ethan decided to raise one last controversial question. Ethan, I've heard some film critics say, Stallone is a symbol of the last century. The era of his heroes is over. What would you say to those critics? Stallone, eyes half closed in thought. I'd say everyone's time ends sooner or later. But as long as you have a voice, as long as you can still say something to the world, you're still relevant. I love what I do, and if people enjoy it, does it really matter if my heroes are out of date? What matters is that these stories leave a mark on people's hearts. And when they really do send me to the archives, I'll gladly retire knowing I made my contribution. The audience applauded. It was honest and human. Ethan felt a certain respect for Stallone's directness, but he still had to maintain the tension for the show's sake. Ethan, gathering his notes. Well then, Mr. Stallone, thank you for your candor. I think we've only scratched the surface. Masculinity, violence, heroism, these are extremely complex topics, and you can't reduce them to a simple formula. I believe many will agree with you that today's world needs people who don't give up, yet remain compassionate. Though some will still argue your ideas are outdated. I guess the key is to keep the dialogue going. Stallone, nodding exactly. It's the discussion that moves us forward. Thanks for giving me the chance to share my views, Ethan. Afterward and societal impact, the show ended, but the effects of their conversation were just beginning to spread. Social media continued to buzz with commentary. Some defended Stallone, pointing out that his notion of strength was never simplistic. Others claimed the star was simply rebranding himself to stay relevant. News shows, talk shows, and experts, psychologists, cultural analysts, started weighing in on whether Stallone's heroes were truly outdated, or if they provided fundamental lessons society still needs. Young vloggers invited each other to live streams to debate toxic masculinity versus the necessity of strength. Memes appeared featuring Rocky saying, "Strength is not cruelty," while Rambo added, "But without strength, you might not survive." Ethan Caldwell didn't remain in the background either. Part of his audience was disappointed that he failed to corner Stallone, while others praised his skill in asking tough questions tactfully. In his own blog, Ethan noted that despite his attempts to criticize old-school methods, he couldn't deny how people like Stallone continue to influence millions. Meanwhile, Sylvester Stallone, returning home after the interview, felt somewhat drained but satisfied. He hadn't set out to reform anyone or prove that his truth was the only truth. He merely wanted to share insights gained over the years and remind people that strength, like any human trait, can take different forms. Sometimes it literally saves lives. Sometimes it's what keeps us from breaking on the inside. Most importantly, it doesn't exclude kindness and empathy. In the following days, Hollywood and the broader world continued to dissect the interview, from serious analysts on major networks to devoted fans in Facebook groups. Whether or not people agreed with Stallone, they had to admit that in an often bewildered and polarized modern society, his voice echoed with surprising relevance. Some saw it as the last gasp of the old guard. Others saw it as the beginning of something new. But there was no denying the impact of his words. Thus, Ethan Caldwell's interview with Sylvester Stallone became more than just a dialogue between two individuals. It ignited a broader social discussion. Does the world grow softer? Or does it still need heroes capable of standing firm? Should we preserve old-school masculinity or seek new forms? And in the end, what does real strength mean? There were no simple answers to these questions. But one thing became clear. As long as there are challenges requiring courage and resolve, problems that can knock people down, there will always be room for those prepared to take the hit, no matter which century we live in.